Tumbled across the rain-slicked asphalt, a yellow umbrella lay abandoned. One monster evaded justice for 30 years while 10,000 leads went cold. However, a microscopic drop in April 1988, 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley walked through her Fort Wayne neighborhood. The young girl was merely trying to retrieve an umbrella left at a friend's house. It was Good Friday, a day that should have been defined by quiet reflection and the anticipation of Easter Sunday. In this corner of the American Midwest, the world felt small, safe, and predictable. A place where doors often remained unlocked and children played until the streetlights hummed to life. Neighbors knew the rhythm of the streets, and children like April, with her bright eyes and innocent smile, were the heartbeat of the community. She was a typical 8-year-old, full of energy and purpose, even for a task as mundane as fetching an umbrella. But as the minutes stretched into an hour and the gray Indiana light began to fade over the Allen County horizon, the domestic peace was shattered. April never made it to her friend's door. The walk was short, only a few blocks, but somewhere in that brief distance, a predator was waiting. By the time her mother realized something was wrong, the rain was washing away the only clues that remained. The disappearance of April Tinsley didn't just spark a massive search. It ended an era of innocence for every family in the city, marking the beginning of a haunting mystery that would The silence that followed her disappearance was deafening. A void filled only by the cold, biting wind of Her family was left with a haunting question that would take 3 decades to answer, while a killer began a long game of cat and mouse with the local police. The rain eventually stopped falling over Allen County, but the atmosphere in Fort Wayne remained heavy with a chilling realization. This wasn't a standard investigation. As months bled into years, the urgency of the initial search faded into the agonizing, slow-motion grief of a cold case. Detectives Brian Martin and Gary Hamilton found themselves staring at a case file that refused to give up its secrets, even as the community. Then, in 1990, 2 years after April's small body was discovered in that DeKalb County ditch, the predator decided to speak. He didn't use a phone or a letter sent to the police station. Instead, he chose a weathered barn door in a rural area near the original crime scene. Scrawled in a frantic, disturbing hand were the words that would haunt the town for the next 3 decades. "I kill 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley, did I kill again?" The message was a lightning bolt of terror. It proved the killer wasn't just a ghost from a rainy afternoon in 1988. He was a living, breathing resident of their world who was actively monitoring the investigation. He was taunting the very men sworn to catch him, reveling in the fact that he had remained invisible. Police processed the barn door, taking photographs and analyzing the handwriting, but the trail stopped at the edge of the wood line. There were no witnesses to the writing, no fingerprints left on the rough wood, and no additional clues to suggest who had held the pen. This was a specific type of psychological warfare, a signature of a predator who wanted credit for his cruelty but lacked the courage to face the light. But there was one detail that didn't make sense, and no one noticed it yet. Following the 1990 message, the killer pulled back into the shadows, and For 14 long years, the Tinsley file sat on a shelf, gathering dust but never being forgotten. The investigators grew older, their hair graying as they thought about the girl who never got to grow up. They looked at the handwriting samples every week, comparing them to every local sex offender and every petty criminal who cycled through the Allen County Jail. The technology of the time was their greatest enemy. In the early 1990s, DNA testing was in its infancy, and the samples recovered from the crime scene were precious and limited. They couldn't afford to waste them on tests that might provide no answers. The killer seemed to know this, or perhaps he was simply content to live his ordinary life in the suburbs, watching the neighborhood children play from behind the safety of his own curtains. He was a neighbor, a coworker, a face in the grocery store line, hiding 30 years of lies behind a mask of mundane normalcy. He waited for the memory of his crime to fade, unaware that science was slowly, methodically catching up to him. Every year that passed wasn't a victory for him. It was a countdown. At the Fort Wayne Police Department, the detectives kept the light on in the evidence room, waiting for the one mistake that every killer eventually makes. They didn't know that the next time he struck, he wouldn't be looking for a victim. The silence had lasted for 14 long years, leading many in Indiana to believe that the shadow which had fallen over Fort Wayne in 1988 had finally dissipated. The 1990 message, scrawled on a barn door, had been the last direct sign of life from April's killer. And as the decade turned, the case settled into the quiet archives of the Allen County Sheriff's Department. Then came Memorial Day weekend in 2004. What should have been a peaceful holiday for local families turned into a nightmare when several residents discovered disturbing packages left on their property. In 4 separate locations, small plastic bags were found hanging from the handlebars of bicycles belonging to young girls or tucked discreetly into residential mailboxes. Inside were used condoms and pieces of paper. The writer explicitly claimed he didn't stop there. The notes contained graphic threats, claiming he was currently watching other children in the neighborhood and waiting for his next opportunity to kill. But what investigators discovered next changed everything. When the Indiana State Police Forensic Laboratory analyzed the biological evidence recovered from those discarded condoms, they found the definitive link they had been seeking for 16 years. The DNA profile was an identical match to the evidence found on April's body in 1988. This was the breakthrough the department had dreamed of, confirming that the predator was not a ghost or a distant memory, but a living, breathing. It proved the killer was arrogant, perhaps even feeling untouchable, as he had essentially handed the police his own genetic blueprint. However, the sense of triumph was rapidly replaced by frustration. Even with a clean, high-quality DNA profile, the National CODIS database yielded no matches. The killer had no prior felony convictions on his record, meaning he remained a faceless name in a city of thousands. He was a man with no criminal footprint, a quiet neighbor or a coworker who had successfully hidden his dark impulses for over a decade. The 2004 taunts served as a chilling reminder that the clock was ticking, and the monster was much closer than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The physical trail had been frozen for 3 decades, but in May 2018, the investigation into April's murder, everything they believed up to this point was wrong. The killer wasn't a career criminal already sitting in a prison cell for another offense. He was a phantom who had successfully avoided the law's reach by simply never being arrested for a felony. It wasn't going to be a fingerprint or a surprise witness that broke the... Detectives turned to an emerging revolutionary field known as forensic investigative genetic genealogy, enlisting the expertise of C.C. Moore and the special... They handed over the DNA profile derived from the biological evidence left behind in 1988 and again in 2004. That one tiny preserved drop of truth that the killer could never take back. C.C. Moore took that comprehensive genetic data and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public database where everyday citizens share their DNA results to explore their ancestry. She wasn't looking for a direct hit on the killer himself, as his profile was not in any criminal database. Instead, she was looking for his relatives. Within the first few hours of her search, she identified a cluster of people who shared enough DNA with the suspect to be classified as second cousins. Using those distant relatives as genetic anchor points, Moore began the painstaking process of reverse genealogy. She spent days building out massive interlocking family trees, tracking lineages back to the mid-19th century, and then followed. The work was clinical, exhaustive, and entirely transformative for the cold case. She narrowed the search by geography, looking specifically for branches of the family tree that had taken root in northeast Indiana. She searched for males of the right age who would have been in their late 20s during the spring of 1988. One by one, the branches of the tree were pruned away, and the names of thousands of innocent men were discarded. Finally, the search collapsed into a single, terrifyingly specific target: the Miller family. By July 2nd, 2018, the genetic map pointed directly to just two brothers. One of them, a man named John D. Miller, lived in Grueling, a quiet town nestled in Amish country just 20 miles from the ditch where April had been found. The sun rose over the quiet town of Grueling, Indiana, on July 15th, 2018, just as it had for thousands of mornings since that rainy April day in 1988. Only 20 miles separated this peaceful neighborhood from the spot where an 8-year-old's life had been stolen. But for 30 years, that detectives Brian Martin and Sarah Moore, they came with the absolute certainty of a DNA match pulled from a discarded piece of trash, a single biological thread that finally connected the horrors of the past to a man living a mundane, unremarkable life. When they knocked on the door of the small brick house on State Street, they weren't just looking for a suspect. They were looking for an end to 3 decades of lies. John D. Miller, now 59 years old, appeared at the door as a shadow of the predator who had once taunted a city. He looked like any other resident of the small town, someone you might pass in the grocery store without a second thought. But as the detectives began their interview, there was no denial, no complex web of alibis, and no fight. When they asked him if he knew why they had traveled to his doorstep after all these years, Miller simply looked at them and spoke her name: April Tinsley. It was a moment of clarity that ended one of Indiana's longest nightmares. He confessed to the 1988 abduction and murder, describing the details with a chilling level of recall that proved the memory had never left him, even as the legal resolution was swift but heavy. In December 2018, inside an Allen County courtroom, the weight of 30 years finally crashed down. Because the crime had been committed in 1988, Miller was sentenced under the Indiana statutes of that time. He received the maximum possible sentence, 40 years for murder and 40 years for child molestation. This 80-year term ensured that the man who had stolen April's future would spend the remainder of his own life behind a steel door. For the residents of Fort Wayne, it was more than just a verdict. It was the closing of a chapter that had defined their community's fears for a generation. The age of innocence might have ended in 1988, but in 2018, the truth finally brought a measure of peace back to the rain-slicked streets where a little girl once walked with her umbrella. Does the finality of a confession ever truly balance the scales for 30